Welcome back, film fans. So, I saw Killers of the Flower Moon about a month ago now, and I saw it at a local cinema. Local cinema. It was an Art Deco styled cinema, so it was a nice venue to see the film. And as those of you that are aware, perhaps maybe you're not, if you haven't seen the film, it's the latest Martin Scorsese film that was made for Apple TV. It's having a short theatrical run, then it's going to end up on their streaming platform. And it's the talking point for a lot of people, besides you could argue the subject matter of the film, which is about deals with the subject of kind of Native American genocide, as it were, was, and I think that should be the focus of probably the debates around the film. But the main, for a lot of people, the source of debate around this film has been the running time. The film is, I believe, 207 minutes long. So it's around 3.5 hours long. And I saw this film with a group of friends. We went, and it was without an intermission. Now, intermissions haven't been a frequent, they're kind of like not a routine procedure, if you like, that's been done by cinema chains or cinemas at all since the 80s, I believe, in which and when it was phased out, which is kind of an interesting point in of itself that we could perhaps get onto. But cinemas, with using their discretion, have kind of been introducing intermissions or flirting with the idea of reintroducing them for films of this length, because this is not the first film this year, kind of big theatrical release that we've had, in which the 3 hour runtime has been hit, and people have started noticing or complaining perhaps that there needs to be intermissions put in place for films that are this long. So, for example, films this year, just to speak of a few examples, I think the new Batman movie was 3 hours long. I haven't seen it, but I suppose it was 3 hours long. Oppenheimer, Christopher Nolan's new movie, was 3 hours long. James Cameron's sequel to Avatar, Avatar 2, was also 3 hours plus long, as is the latest Scorsese movie. As was Scorsese's last movie, The Irishman, was, I think, even longer by just a couple of minutes, also 3.5 hours long. So there seems to be this supposed trend in which movies are getting longer, which I don't buy, by the way. I think the only reason we call it a trend is because by virtue of the fact they're kind of notable differences to the norm. They're notable examples, so we label it a trend. When actually speaking, are movies getting that much longer? I actually think maybe it says something that it's notable movies, if you call them big budget, or at least movies with a lot of publicity surrounding them and hype surrounding them, are getting longer run times. But movies in general, there have been studies that suggest that that movies have been increasing by around 10 or 20 minutes, roughly, on average run time. But I wanted this to kind of open up the discussion in terms of, because of the 3.5 hour runtime of Killers of the Flower Moon, there have been, like I said, discussions, articles, pieces written, and we returning to this age old debate, which I personally can't stand, which is, are movies getting longer, or is there a kind of ideal runtime for a movie? Now, no one's, I don't think, explicitly asking the latter of those two questions, but I think in asking the first question, you're presupposing there is an ideal runtime for a movie. So we're getting a lot of these kind of responses where it's like, well, The Killers of the Flower Moon was great, but it was just too long. So again, does it beg the question of what is an ideal runtime for a movie? Okay, so like I said, I saw this without intermissions. Me and the people I was with, none of us got up. Our bladders were howled, thankfully, as did most people's, I think. Not that I was paying too much attention to people's bladders. I don't know where that's going, but yeah, anyway. But I can understand how it would be obviously an issue for people in terms of just having to sit still that long, particularly in the kind of our modern day age, of which we suppose this ADHD culture, as I like to call it, kind of the idea that people do seem to find it harder to sit still and command their attention to one thing for a sustained period of time anymore. It seems to be like increasingly more difficult for people to do that, given the prevalence of like sensory overload of modern multimedia technology, etc., etc. Whole scrolling phenomenon, streaming services, that phenomenon of you take longer to choose a movie than you do to watch it sometimes, that kind of thing. And so, for example, The Guardian wrote an article when Killers of the Flower Moon came out, and they asked this question of, are movies getting too long? And I think it's an interesting question to ask, albeit a kind of, like I say, an infuriating one that annoys me personally. And I'll get to like my take on it at the end of this video, because I think the questions being asked, or the reason why we might be seeing maybe a rise in phenomenon of longer movies, longer notable movies, is this idea that they're competing with television, right? Because I don't know about any of you, but like I've had several conversations with people whereby I'll say, you get onto the topic of films and television, and people will literally state a preference as to what they like, and they'll say, oh, I don't watch films, I prefer television. As if like you have to choose one or the other. And the reason they usually give is because they'll say, well, film is too much of a commitment of my time, whereas television, I can watch one episode and be done with it. Which I always find a kind of like paradoxically ironic argument almost, because it's like, for me, a film, it could be an hour to 3 hours long, let's say, typically speaking, 90 minutes to 3 hours long, right? But a television show is a huge commitment of your time, because it's anywhere between 10 to 80 to 100 hours long, depending on how big the series is. But that the justification being, oh, well, I can stop it at any time, is if like the home media convenience of pausing or stopping a film doesn't exist. Although we know, of course, that films are meant to be consumed in one sitting. But, quality TV trends nowadays dictate that kind of one episode follows on from the other, so that plots really aren't standalone anymore. So you're getting developing narratives and plot developments, character arcs, etc., etc. Themes develop across time, across episodes and series. So I don't think that argument holds too much sway anymore with television anyway, if that's like the kind of discerning reason as to why you would pick television over film. But nonetheless, more and more people have been drawn to the kind of the kind of demands and the values of prestige TV, quality TV, over, say, films. And so it brings up this interesting idea of why sit through a film anymore, I suppose, for some people that is going to be 3.5 hours long. But for me, there's another ironic flip side to that coin, which is, I think it's a silly question to ask of someone if they're going out of their way to see a film in the first place. For example, I find with me personally, let's take the example of Killers of the Flower Moon. The running time wasn't an issue for me at all, and I knew what it was going in, precisely because I was going out of my way to see the film. I was going to a specific venue, specific place with people to watch the film. So it was an event in of itself, all right? Albeit cinema is now a lower key event than it used to be in the kind of golden age of cinema. Nonetheless, it's still an event. It's a kind of social event or gathering of some sorts. But if I was watching this at home and I had two films in front of me, let's say Killers of the Flower Moon and a film that was 2 hours long, would I be less inclined to choose Killers of the Flower Moon because it does feel less convenient to me for some reason, even though I'm in the confines of my own home? I probably would be less inclined to choose it. Okay, even removing my kind of subjective opinion of what I thought of the film in general, because I would ironically see it again as more of a commitment of my time. So that kind of brings into question this idea of, to what extent do we see film as a point of leisure, a leisure activity, and then once it passes a certain threshold, we see it as laborious, that it's a form of labouring time that's taking away from our time. So this is kind of like precious balancing act that seems to be in place for a lot of people unconsciously when choosing, picking, and watching a film. And this specific Guardian article actually listed a kind of loads of notable successful films that have either done really well at the box office financially, or did really well at awards, or just really popular, enduring classics, canonical classics of cinema. And it's interesting. I will go through them briefly and just list their runtimes, because they list the runtimes beside them. And I think it's interesting to know how many of these... Okay, let's see what we can discern from actually the films that are named here. So we have Titanic, which, as we know, won a record amount of Oscars at the time. I think it was 11 or 12, wasn't it? Or 11 out of 12 nominations or something. It's 194 minutes long, right? Schindler's List, 195 minutes long. some see it as Steven Spielberg's masterpiece, for example. So that's the notable example. Another notable example not listed here would be Barry Lyndon. For a lot of people now, that's Kubrick's masterpiece. It's its longest film. Do people like it, ironically, or do they like it more because it's his longest film? Okay, some people say it's his most boring film. Again, is that because of the runtime? Spartacus, 197 minutes. Okay, Godfather Part 2 is 200 minutes long. Lord of the Rings: Return of the King, which I did see at the cinema when I was younger, 201 minutes long. And I failed to sit through that entire movie without having to go to the toilet, I must admit. But I was a kid, so nonetheless, it did hold my attention, though. Apocalypse Now, they've got here 202 minutes. I assume that's not the theatrical cut. That must be the Redux cut that came out in 2001, I think. They got The Irishman, 209 minutes. So maybe it's The Irishman that's slightly longer than Killers of the Flower Moon. But nonetheless, so Scorsese's last two films now have been over 3 hours long. And there's something I think to be said there of maybe it's to do with the freedom that he has in working with streaming services that enable him to essentially have what some may argue less discipline, actually, in the sense that he's able to just have his films at longer running times. I mean, Scorsese is someone who typically makes his films, particularly from the 90s onwards, I'd say over 2 hours long. So he's not someone who's always like kind of mastered in a kind of 90-minute film. In fact, it's hard to think of a 90-minute film that he made. You'd have to go all the way back, I think. Ben-Hur at 212 minutes. Lawrence of Arabia at 216. So then we get into this idea of like it's the epics, okay? And indeed, maybe they're epics by virtue of their running time. Once Upon a Time in America, 229 minutes. And indeed, there is a longer cut. The long cut that Leone made is now in existence because it was screened at a film festival, I think, a year or two ago. But whether that ever sees the light of day due to rights issues in terms of, you know, how it's exhibited and then how it's brought out in physical media, I don't know. Dances with Wolves, 236 minutes long, which got a load of Oscars assessed back in the day. Famously beat out all the other films to the best film Oscar, didn't it? Best picture. Gone with the Wind, 238 minutes, and Cleopatra, 248. Again, two more kind of sweeping epics, as it were. But runtimes shouldn't be just reserved for epics, right? I think a thing to note here is, and this is one of my problems I have with this question, in begging the question, are movies getting longer or too long? Is if there's some ideal notion of what a film should be in terms of its length. I think it's begging the question. It's a normative question. It implies that there should be a ideal running time for a movie, which I think is silly. You wouldn't make, for example, the same demands of, if you walked into an art gallery and had a series of paintings, you wouldn't bemoan a painting for being too small or too big. It would just be an odd complaint to make. So why do we do the same thing when it comes to film? Now, I know film is a kind of temporal art form or medium that it's to be experienced through time, but nonetheless, you just wouldn't. I think it's an odd demand to make of a particular film, just in of itself, that it should be a certain amount of time. Okay? I always think back to Abbas Kiarostami, the Iranian film director, who said, there's only good movies and bad movies. So if you're not enjoying your time watching a film, 2 hours can feel interminable. Okay? So if it's a 3-hour movie, you're going to hate it, right? If you're just not enjoying it. But some of these movies I've just listed here with these long run times, how many of them do we adore and cherish? And we don't think of their runtime as being a particular obstacle. Indeed, we could think of it as a virtue. So, yeah, in begging the question of runtimes, that's what I don't like about it, is it presupposes this idea. And also I think it prioritizes, it's a commercial question. And this goes back to this idea when I said earlier that about in the UK we got rid of intermissions, widely spread intermissions in the 1980s. I think that feeds into this idea that obviously the studios were pressing for higher profits, so we were making films for people, a wider array of people, which obviously seems rating certifications come down in the long term. But also what happens, of course, is you're trying to squeeze more and more screenings in a day. One way of doing that is indeed getting rid of your 15-minute intermission. Okay, you do that over a day, you can squeeze in another screening of the same film. So I think it's a commercial question. It's a question that's been asked when cinemas become increasingly more commercialized and corporatized. You wouldn't ask, for example, it'd be absurd, and this does indeed happen with music, right? Why we don't demand that all songs be 3 minutes long, but you do if you want them to get commercial radio play time. Otherwise, you just get a truncated version of a song that could be 6 minutes. You get it down to 3 minutes or 3.5, 4 minutes. What does that say? What's that doing to the kind of the art form of the song, the structure of the song? It wasn't designed to be played that way. Well, a film isn't designed necessarily. The demands or dictates of the story or whatever the filmmaker has in mind, they might want it to be. It might need more than 2 hours long as a structure. Indeed, so a couple of examples I've got here, aside from the kind of the commercial concerns, is what about filmmakers that just specialize in making longer form movies? Okay, one of the more recent successful Japanese filmmakers, Ryosuke Hamaguchi, who made arguably, for a lot of people, one of the best films of 2020, I think, Drive My Car. That was over 3 hours long. One of his earlier films, 2015's Happy Hour, was 5.5 hours long. So there are filmmakers out there who, yes, some might categorize or relegate, if they think this is a negative quality, relegate them to art house filmmakers, where that's where you go to make longer form films. Again, there's this kind of artificial imposition we're putting there where it's, if you want to make longer films, you're an art house filmmaker. And I think that's a false and problematic dichotomy. An even more extreme example would be the Filipino filmmaker Lav Diaz, who makes films that are, I don't think he's ever made a film under 3 hours. And a lot of his films can run up to 7, 8, 9 hours long. You would probably describe them as indeed endurance tests. I've only actually seen one of his films because obviously with that caveat, there comes a caveat that his films are harder to see because they're less commercially viable. But these are filmmakers who, for them, the commercial imperatives come second to perhaps their aesthetic, political, or formal concerns, their artistic concerns. And I think maybe perhaps one of the most notable examples is the idea of, which is really kind of highlights the kind of the idiocy of such a debate, I think, is Christian Marquez's The Clock. Now, those of you who don't know what The Clock was, it was a 24-hour kind of film art installation. So it's a 24-hour film in which was made up of a series of shots from different movies of clocks. And each minute showed, so each clip was shown to show, each minute of time would have to be represented for the entire 24 hours through clocks, through pre-existing films. And the idea was a viewer would go in and you could watch as little or as much of this film as you want. And in 24 hours, the film would start over again with the 24-hour clock. That very art installation, I think you could argue one of the reasons why it was made was to kind of completely deconstruct this idea that a film, well, first of all, it just deconstructs the idea of a beginning and a middle and an end of a film, in the sense that it's circular, cyclical, and makes time itself a subject. But in so doing, actually destroys this idea that that film should have a kind of set running time to it in the first place. Again, I didn't see any of this art installation, The Clock. In fact, obviously, I think it's an art installation, so once it's done, it's done. But a lot of people that have seen it have said how remarkable it is and how unique and singular of a kind of film it is. But those are some of my thoughts and perspectives on what I bring to this whole kind of this what I think is a non-debate and a non-issue. Actually, I think that filmmakers should be allowed to make films as long as they want them, but then obviously subject to critique. Yes, particular films we could say are bad or too long in that particular instance. When it comes to Killers of the Flower Moon, for example, I didn't notice the runtime. I was aware it was over 2 hours long, but I never clock watched. And I personally, it wasn't an issue in of itself for me, and it didn't affect the structure of the film, as it were. In fact, more of my issues with the film are to do with what's included or not included rather than included in the film in terms of its depictions and what it chooses to talk and cover and talk about in the confines of its story. So I could argue that actually Killers of the Flower Moon deserves to be longer, or indeed the same length, but take or prioritise certain narrative choices over others. So yeah, those are my thoughts on this. What are your thoughts on this debate? Maybe you do have a kind of code, which is if a film's typically over 2 hours or 2.5 hours, I don't tend to like it. But it would be interesting to know what your notable exceptions are if you do have that rule. So let me know your thoughts on film running times. Is it an issue for you? Is it not? Would you rather keep long film running times out of kind of your overly commercial or blockbuster films and just have those more disciplined and shorter run times? Or like myself, do you think it's kind of a non-debate and a non-issue ultimately? But let me know your thoughts. I just thought it'd be an interesting talking point, specifically because it does seem to be a more prevalent thing this year, a trend of 2023, I guess. I mean, look at Barbenheimer, right? That's a great example. People chose to do a double bill of two films, one of which was already 3 hours long, the intermission being the break between the two films. And that proved very successful as a kind of, it wasn't even commercially inspired, right? It was a kind of like meme double bill for a lot of people that became very commercially successful for both films. So yeah, let me know what you guys thought about that. And I'll see you on the next one. And as always, take care.